Hello, I'm Chris O'Loughlin. I'm Head of School of Psychiatry in the East of England. So I was speaking to some trainees recently who were struggling a bit to know how best to set up their training portfolio, how to think about what might usefully go in that. So I thought I'd throw together this video to introduce the training portfolio, think about how it can be used by trainees and who else is using it. So I hope this will be helpful for you. What we'll cover is a bit of just brief introduction on the purpose of the portfolio and how to set it up if you're coming fresh to the portfolio, and then think about how to use that to plan your training, how to use it for work-based placed assessments and other evidence that might go in there, and then finally look at supervisors' reports and supervision. We'll run through these in order. A couple of warnings. Firstly, that one of the key interactions is between the portfolio and the curriculum, and the curriculum for psychiatry training in the UK is changing probably in 2021, so things may well be different there. And the other thing is some of the curriculum has changed a little bit due to the COVID pandemic, and there's guidelines on the college website for how things have changed there, so you'd want to have a look at that as well. But if we start just thinking about why have a portfolio at all, so there is lots of background theory you could get into about the benefits and potential disadvantages of a medical portfolio, but broadly I think it boils down to kind of three main aspects. So firstly, for you, it's a record of your development in training, so the things you've achieved, the competencies you've developed, so a collection of evidence about what you've done in training to date. It's also a tool to plan your future training. So that's slightly different. This is now a looking forward to how you might think about what you need to do for the future. And I think it's possibly underused as a tool for that. We'll talk a bit about how that can be used. So both those are for you as a trainee. And the other aspect is that other people will be looking at your portfolio as well. So that will include your supervisors to assist your training. But also at the end of each year, an ARCP panel will look at your portfolio to check you've reached the relevant criteria for progression. And when you're thinking about your portfolio, you probably want to think about all three of these purposes when thinking about what goes in there and how you organize it, because they've all got slightly different emphases, and some things will make it much easier, for example, for your ARCP panel, that you might not necessarily think of if you're just considering how you're using it yourself. So we're going to start by setting up the portfolio. What I'm hoping we're going to be able to do is do this live, as it were, with one of the example portfolios on the website. So this assumes you've got a login already. And you'll see that it's already advising us that some aspects of our profile are missing. We haven't got a supervisor set up, and we've got nothing in our development plan. And we'll come back to other aspects of this dashboard a bit later, but let's correct some of those to start with. So the profile needs updating. So we could click on the profile tab there, but if we go to edit user details, then that will move us automatically through to the profile. And we'll see we've already got the email and GMC number in there, as well as the person's name, so Laura Wilson in this example portfolio. But a few things here we're missing, so let's just put in a date of birth, so 1st of January 1990, we'll put a gender, and this person will be a core trainee as being most relevant. So we'll just update the user there, and we'll see it saying updated, and we've lost that initial warning there. If we move on to the portfolio proper now, the portfolio tab here, then you may well see some other details down this side. So the profile is largely things to do with you that are unlikely to change. The portfolio details here may well change, so things like your educational supervisor or your training program director may well change, and other aspects such as your national training number, your college candidate number, and so on. And you can click on edit and you can go through some of these, for example. So here we want core psychiatry as our specialty, and if we knew them we could put in our candidate number for the Royal Psychiatry exams, our training program approval number, national training number, and so on. But we'll just leave that there and update the portfolio as it is, so we've still got a few bits missing there. As we're setting up the portfolio now, in this portfolio tab, we're going to go through to our supervisors, and we haven't got any supervisors down at the moment. There are quite a few different supervisors you can include, of which the key ones are going to be clinical supervisor, educational supervisor, and probably training program director. Now you may have college tutors as well, you may give temporary access, but you probably want one of those. So let's just click clinical supervisor for the moment, and we'll add the supervisor, and it'll ask for an email address, and then we can nominate them. If the email address is linked already, I think that comes up automatically then. If not linked, then there's an invitation that goes through to register on the portfolio, but trainers would typically be registered on the portfolio already. It is worth checking out which email address your trainer uses, so it'll usually be the work address you're used to, but it's possible they'll be using either a home email address or an alternative work email address. So it's definitely worth checking that out, because otherwise things can get a little more complicated and your trainers might not receive it. And you'd want to go through that for, as I say, clinical supervisor, educational supervisor, and training program director. So that would remove that other warning. The next thing as you're setting up your portfolio is you want to include aspects of your career history. And that would allow people looking at your portfolio to see what training posts you've done. And this example portfolio already has some in here. So you can see here actually someone's completed a CT3 60% post, and a little bit of information about that being an acute inpatient unit rehab. And that's very easy to add in. You click on new career entry, specialty training post, and it comes up with those things. As I say, we won't go in detail of some of the aspects of the portfolio, but you can put in a start date, end date, specialty, and so on. You have to complete how much it's part-time or full-time, and it is very helpful to put in the notes just a little bit about the post, because otherwise it would typically only include maybe a job title, which could be a CT training post, and the locality. So putting in something, for example, about it being an inpatient post or a community post, or whether it's an adult post or a child and adolescent post, is really quite useful there. And as you see, that's been done here. And on this earlier example, there are far fewer details, and it just says job title CT2 trainee, so we don't really have a sense, if someone's coming to your portfolio, much about that post at all. So having just a few extra details is really helpful, and obviously make sure you complete whether it's part-time or not. Now this is usually probably enough to see where you are in training, which is going to be very useful for your supervisors to help you think about your career, and also the ARCP panel to know what they're kind of measuring you against. That's not always the case if people have complicated routes through training. So if people have varying amounts of full-time and part-time training, if people have time out of program for out-of-program experiences or parental leave, then things can get rather more complicated. In which case you may well want to add to your portfolio, and I'll show you how a bit later, the Royal College Time and Training Calculator. Now that's easily found. Just go to Google, Royal College of Psychiatry Time Training, and that web page will take you through to an Excel spreadsheet you can download, which looks like this. So you can put in your name, start and end dates for each post, how many sessions you're doing, and how long your training program is, and it will tell you when your projected completion date is. And that can become very useful both for yourself as a trainee and for supervisors and ARCP panels to know where you are in training and how much is left, to make sure you don't miss out anything in training along the way. So we'll just close that and go back to the portfolio. So the other thing while you're setting up your portfolio is you probably want to set up some folders initially. So again, in this example portfolio, these have been set up as CT3, CT2 and CT1 folders, and that will allow you to collect evidence for a particular training year. So CT3, the specialty, start date, and you can put in the end date if it's historical, and it will create a folder that will collect information in the portfolio for later, and allows sorting of activities that you're adding. So that's really all you need to do to set up the portfolio. So pretty straightforward. Some things like career history and supervisors you'll be changing every time you change post. Some of them, like your profile, are pretty much constant. So the next question really is going to be, what do you actually want to put in the portfolio? So what evidence should you be collecting, and how to use these various other tabs? So let's just have a bit of a think about that. What we want to look at to see what we should be doing in training is the training curriculum. And again, very easy to find on Google at the Royal College of Psychiatry webpage. We can find out about the new curriculum as it's being developed for next year, 2021. But the current curriculum will be here, and for a core trainee, you'll want to load the core psychiatry training curriculum. And actually I've got that loaded in an Adobe Reader, so we can have a look through it. So this essentially describes elements of training that are relevant, in this case for a core trainee. It starts off with curriculum development and responsibilities for curriculum delivery in the first part, which are the kind of background to training and the structures involved around training. And then a significant part is the core psychiatry curriculum, and that's divided up into actually up to 19 intended learning outcomes, which we'll have a look at in a moment. And then finally, methods of learning and teaching, which includes aspects of psychotherapy requirements in core training, on-call requirements, and various other competencies that actually aren't contained in this middle block. And then how it'll be assessed and how ARCP panels might look at this. So if we go to the main aspects of the curriculum, these intended learning outcomes, let's just click on the first one there. So this falls under the first domain of good medical practice, knowledge, skills and performance, and you'll see the intended learning outcome 1 relates to performing a specialist assessment of patients and documenting history and examination. And there are subdivisions for that, but what we're looking at in the initial thing is taking a history, defining signs and symptoms, recognise the importance of historical data, completing a clinical history as a skill, and then another subdivision, patient examination, and then moving on to the next learning outcome, construct a formulation of patient's problems. And this goes through from clinical skills for the initial learning outcomes to gradually increasingly non-clinical skills later down to do with, for example, education or research, professionalism, and so on. So this is going to be probably the core of your curriculum in terms of what you're trying to demonstrate. And there is a colour coding in there, so things that are in red are appropriate for CT1 training. So if you're new to your portfolio, new to the curriculum, you want to particularly be focusing on the items in red here. And the other thing the curriculum suggests is ways these could be assessed, a way you could demonstrate your competency in these, where this could be assessed. So here, defining symptoms as signs and symptoms could be through these work-based place assessments or exams, and that runs through the entire curriculum. Sorry, just skipping around there a bit. So patient examination are likely to be assessed through these clinical work-based place assessments, such as the assessment of clinical expertise and case-based discussions, case presentations, and the CASC exam towards the end of core training. And again, these ones in red are most appropriate for CT1 trainees. So that's to some extent what you should be aiming towards. The other thing, just going back to the curriculum, is the tab for PDP for your development. We haven't got anything in here now, but I would suggest that creating a PDP item is a way of taking some control of your training, so you're not just in a post, to some extent learning from what kind of comes your way or comes in the door, gets referred through to clinic, or however the post works, but allows you to think in advance of the kind of things you want to be learning, maybe from the curriculum, maybe a bit beyond the curriculum, in that specific post. So that over the course of, in core training, probably 6 training posts, you're covering the entire curriculum, but you're aware in advance of what you're going to focus on in each post. So here, let's just set up quickly a new learning objective for the development plan for this particular trainee. So let's have it from the start of August, when someone was starting in post, and this is going to be clinical experience. You can add tags if you like. I'm not going to go into detail there to help describe things, but this is a new trainee, so we're going to have in the description perhaps developing skills in taking a psychiatric history and performing a mental state examination in acute adult inpatients, if that's the post, and have a think about how we're going to achieve that. So we're going to achieve that through clinical experience on the ward, discussion with the supervisor, and workplace-based assessments. We might do reading, so there are some good books on psychiatric interviewing. It's certainly worth catching up with, and perhaps feedback from the multidisciplinary team, and we'll complete that by the end of January. And we'll submit that as our first item on this development plan, and we'll see that's come up there. And you probably want perhaps 3 or 4 specific learning objectives within a post, so you'll be accumulating aspects of the curriculum beyond that, but things that you particularly want to focus on during that post should form part of your development plan. Not by any means all clinical, but they're likely to be a mixture of clinical and non-clinical skills. And then the other thing we can do with our development plan is link it to the curriculum. So we click on competencies here, and we'll see we've got the core psychiatry curriculum up, and so we were talking about taking history and doing a mental state examination. So that would certainly be relevant for this intended learning outcome. We didn't include formulation or investigations, quite possibly because we're working on an adult inpatient ward. We do want to look at the patient's potential for self-harm or harm to others, so we would put that in there as relevant for that particular learning outcome, and conducting therapeutic interviews. So perhaps we'll have that as the competencies most relevant to that particular item in our development plan, which will now appear down there. So we'll come back to that a little bit later. But this, using the personal development plan, does allow you to look towards what you want to achieve over the next few months, rather than the portfolio just being a record of what you have achieved. So let's move on now and think about work-based placed assessments. So we'll bring the portfolio back up, and under assessments, which is where all the work-based placed assessments are collected, you can see a range of work-based placed assessments. We'll come back to this one in a moment, and the option to start a new assessment. Now actually quite a lot of the assessments will be started by the other person who will log on to their portfolio and bring up your name to do an assessment on, but you can trigger an assessment from here, and if we do that, we'll see the range of work-based placed assessments available. So the mini-PAT, mini-peer assessment tool, 360-degree feedback. The more clinically based ones, assessment of clinical expertise, case-based discussions, mini assessment of clinical encounters. So an ACE would typically be a whole meeting with a patient. A mini ACE might be a specific part of that. Case-based discussions are discussed with your supervisor, and direct observation and procedural skills will be for things like ECT, perhaps venipuncture, more practical hands-on things. And then a variety of non-clinical work-based placed assessments, such as assessments of teaching, case presentations, journal club presentations, and so on. And then specialist psychotherapy ones, of which in CT1 the most important is the case-based discussion group assessment. So you could start any of these from within your portfolio. Just a word about the mini PAT. So you would be doing one of these for each of the posts you're in. So in core training, typically 2 in a training year. And they do take quite a while to set up. So you do need to nominate assessors from within the team you're working with and give them time to respond. So they do need quite a bit of planning for thinking about the right time you're going to be doing that. So just a word of warning there, sometimes trainees run a little bit close to their ARCP with the mini PAT feedback given the amount of time it takes. So here we've got a work-based place assessment already completed. So I did this one in preparation for this talk. So it's a assess clinical encounter, and this has been completed with some marks which are perhaps the least useful part maybe of the work-based place assessment about how this person did. So obviously fairly pleased with their approach through a number of areas and better than expected. But what's more useful in work-based place assessments on the whole is the feedback. So here's some feedback about what went well, putting the patient at their ease despite their symptoms, structuring the conversation well, some suggestions for development about asking about psychotic symptoms and checking that you've understood the patient's difficulties correctly, and making sure you've really pinned down what's going on in the patient's mind there, and to have a think about what the person might do as an agreed action. So here looking at the present state examination, questions for psychosis, just to further refine that interview style. So that's a work-based place assessment. So let's go to that tab up there, competencies, and it's brought up our current PDP. You remember we put in this item to do with clinical history taking and so on. Or you could link it through to the core psychiatry curriculum. So let's not link it through to the PMP, let's actually link it through to the core psychiatry curriculum, and this are the intended learning outcomes we've seen from the curriculum document already. So here, so this was an ACE, work-based place assessment, so it does link very importantly through to clinical history, patient examination, and so on. So perhaps again therapeutic interviewing. So there we are, so we can put that in. So now we can see that this work-based place assessment has been mapped through to these competencies. Or we could go through to the PDP and link it to things we've specifically raised already, so in which case these would be very similar as we've done already. So PDP and, so not that one actually, this one will link through directly to the curriculum and through to the PDP for the same things. And then you could see that when you go to the PDP, there will be aspects that have been covered, so 3 out of the 4 we ticked originally there, and when you click on it, you'll see that we've got this ACE now included in our mapped evidence towards this PDP. So that's okay. Now how are you going to know which of these assessments to do over the course of a year? So you remember we had a look at the curriculum and saw which ones might be helpful to specific aspects of the core training curriculum, so that's a pointer to start with. But the other thing is your ARCP panel, if we scroll down through the curriculum, will also be looking at this table. So this towards the end of the portfolio shows the minimum number of work-based place assessments required per year. So this is considered to be essentially, given the progress in training someone should be making, these are the minimum set of work-based place assessments of various types that would demonstrate that progression. So for a CT1, you'd normally be wanting 2 ACEs over the year, 4 mini ACEs, 4 case-based discussion, and these case-based discussion group assessments from the Barlant group you should be attending. So the range of work-based place assessments. Now, as I mentioned at the start of this talk, these have varied a bit with COVID, because it is quite a bit harder to get ACE and mini ACEs, for example, where you're being directly observed. So panels will have more flexibility to look at, for example, case-based discussions as alternatives. But under normal circumstances, these would be the minimum required number. Obviously, this tends to mean that people see these as targets rather than a kind of minimum number required. So you certainly don't want to be generally getting less than these, but you may well want to get some further work-based place assessments to support your training as you go through. But if you have this table in mind, you can get a bit of a sense of the kind of things you should be doing as a minimum in each post in core training as you move forward, gradually developing more of the psychotherapy work-based place assessments as you do psychotherapy cases, and then some are more appropriate for higher training. So that'll give you a bit of an idea about what kind of work-based placed assessments you would put in your portfolio. So going back to the portfolio then, all the work-based placed assessments are collected under this tab, but there's also an activity tab. So moving to the activities tab, this will collect work-based placed assessments and everything else that's gone into your portfolio, but allows you to put in other activities that aren't work-based placed assessments. So if we click on that, for example, you might have reflection, and there are forms to enable you to do either general reflection or reflection specific to COVID, or you might put in a course attended or a case log. And if you click on one of these ones that comes up automatically, there will be a form that comes up to give you some details. Don't forget that patient confidentiality must be preserved throughout your portfolio. So this will be a case log entry, but you could put in quite a variety of things. And if we go to reflection, you'll see a reflective form describing a clinical or non-clinical experience, what you learnt, and so on. For all these, you can upload your own documents. So if you're wanting to upload a logbook or upload some feedback, for example, you can do this as a new attachment linked into any of the forms under activities in certain file types, but they're pretty flexible really. Obviously Word and spreadsheets and so on. So this would be how you might upload the time in training calculator, for example, to your portfolio to help your ARCP panels see their way through. Just a quick word about reflection. So there is some guidance about how people should add reflection to their portfolio that came out of the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges a couple of years ago. So reflection is an important part of being a doctor, and we certainly want psychiatry trainees to be reflective. It's worth bearing in mind that as well as the reflection being anonymised in terms of patient details, you want to focus on any learning points from it rather than detailed descriptions of what actually happened. The other aspect of reflection is that reflection can be demonstrated not just through reflective pieces in the portfolio, which is perhaps not an ideal way to reflect anyway, but also through discussions with supervisors, supervisors' reports, the other work-based placed assessments like case-based discussions, and so on. So by all means use the reflective notes in your portfolio, but they're not the only way of demonstrating that you are engaged in reflection, so just keep that in mind. And if we bring the portfolio back up, we've covered then activities, assessments, exams gets populated automatically from college data, and we've looked at these tabs. So the last one to look at just briefly are reviews. So in the reviews tab you'll get ARCP outcomes and supervisor reports for educational supervisors and your psychiatric supervisor, so your clinical supervisor, and also you can enter supervision notes here, either from induction or a supervision session. The psychiatric supervisor's report at the end of each post does require quite a bit of input from you as a trainee to help demonstrate from your portfolio how you've achieved what you should have done. So in the psychiatric supervisor report, core psychiatry, if we start that, you will see trainees' comments for all these sessions on how the evidence I've uploaded demonstrates you've covered the skills. and then the rest will be completed by the supervisor on how much they feel that has achieved that, and what comments they make for your particular development going forward in your training. So that is quite a detailed report. The Educational Supervisor report is a rather broader look at your training and doesn't require the trainees' comments in this way. So they all come under the Review tab, along with supervision sessions if you're recording those directly on here, and ALCP outcomes at the end of each year. So the other thing I just want to draw your attention to is from the dashboard. I didn't mention it before. So you have this line along here for core psychiatry, and this helps just see how much of the curriculum you've covered so far. So this, for example, we have 8 competencies with no activities mapped, 19 with 1 activity, so that would be a work-based place assessment or other evidence uploaded, 10 with 2 and 6 with 3, and a summary of your post as it is at the moment, for example, and whether you're full-time or not. So this is a dashboard summary of how much of the curriculum has been covered with how much evidence. So you'd expect this to go up as you're approaching your ALCP, and a quick summary of the post. So that was a very brief run through for how you might set up a portfolio and how you might think about how you're going to use it over the next training year. I should just say there is huge amounts of help available on the portfolio itself, going to the knowledge base there, and if you have a look at building a portfolio, if you're a trainee or supervising a trainee or assessing the trainee, there are lots of articles on getting started on the portfolio, how to develop a personal development plan, mapping activities to competencies, and so on, so that you're really not without help in terms of managing the portfolio. And the portfolio team are very responsive if you've got suggestions on how to improve the portfolio, or something seems to be going wrong and not working quite right. So I certainly recommend having a look at the help articles and step-by-step guides if you're just not quite sure what's happened or where you should go. So in this brief talk, I've looked at the purpose of the portfolio and how you set up the portfolio when you're starting training and for each post, how you might use the portfolio in your PDP to think proactively about the training you want to acquire over the next 6 months or 12 months. Looked at workplace-based assessments, which are likely to be the key part of evidence in your portfolio, but also how to upload other evidence either as documents or reflective forms. We've covered briefly supervisors' reports and where you might go for further help. So I hope this was a useful introduction to the portfolio for you. Please feel free to get in touch if you've got any further questions, but hopefully that will see you along the right path for using your portfolio well and building up to your ALCP without any difficulty. So thank you very much for listening. So I'm Chris O'Loughlin, Head of School of Psychiatry in the East of England, and I hope you found this useful.